Well, all right, everybody, welcome today to the Pastor's Bible Study. Where were y'all last week? I was doing the Lord's work last week, and we had a great trip to Augusta and had a great time at the Masters. It was a lot of fun. And then made it back, but I did watch my man Luke Stair open Genesis 12 for y'all. Good job, Luke. Thank you, man. We're grateful to have Luke, and after watching it, I decided I'd just go back and reteach this section, if that's okay with y'all. No, I'm just kidding. If you look at your outline, we're going to actually pick up where Luke left off. Mostly. I still want to do a quick overview if I can. And I do appreciate what Luke did. Aren't y'all grateful that we have all these talented staff members that just step in and do stuff and lead? My goodness, y'all. And what's interesting to me is they get younger all the time. You know? And anyway, but I'm grateful for each one of them. So, when you get to page 12 in Genesis, actually, where Luke talked to y'all a little bit about the end of chapter 11, there's a monumental shift, if you will, in the biblical material, because we're launching. When you look at this material, when you begin in chapter 11, verse 27, what Luke taught on last week through 12:9, you're beginning the age of the patriarchs. And this is just a massive part of our story. And it is going to be just woven into the psyche of the Jewish mind. This is something they're going to talk about from now on. As a matter of fact, they're even going to refer to their God as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So this material that starts here is just incredibly important. And we'll talk about this more as we go along, but what's going to unfold in front of us is just the religious practices of the patriarchs. And we're going to discover, we're going to learn together, they are fiercely monotheists. They worship a very personal God. They're in a relationship with God. They depend on God's revelation of Himself over and over and over. We're going to hear God speak. They engage in practices of worship and prayer. And this is before we have the law, before we have the temple, before we have the Torah, before we have the Scripture. These folks are walking with a personal God. So it's just an incredible story, and I'm looking forward to journeying through it with you. And it's going to take us a little while. We're in no hurry to get through this, okay? So with that said, most Old Testament and New Testament theologians, they would say that when you turn to page 12 in Genesis, you're beginning what they refer to as redemptive history. And so we place that on the outline for you today. If you're joining us online today, welcome. I forgot to say that. The outline's available for you also. So when we look at redemptive history, as I shared with you in these notes, just like the story of creation, everything begins with the Word of God, a word from God. In other words, God speaks, just like He does at the beginning of creation. So in chapter 12, verse 1, it says, the Lord had said to Abram, go. So we launch with a word from God, and as Luke pointed out to y'all last week, anytime you see Lord in all caps, that's the English translator's way of letting you know this is the covenant name of God, Yahweh. So every time you find in an English translation, Lord written in all caps, that's your clue that this is, underneath it, is that name Yahweh. And then redemptive history does this. If you want to think of it like a I don't know what to call it, maybe not really a funnel, but just very widely, if you will, the story of humanity, Genesis 1 through 11, okay? And then it's going to focus down to a fine point to one person, Abraham. Abram still at this time. And then it's going to widen just a little bit with Abram and Abraham's family. And then it's going to expand once again to include the entire world, all people. So you've got this massive opening at the beginning where the writer is going to tell us the story of the history of all of humanity. And then redemption history now is going to narrow down to this one family, this one person, his family. And through his family, all the peoples of the world are going to be blessed. And that's going to be the rest of the story of the Old Testament, the story of the New Testament, and the story of our day. That's where you and I live. We live on this side of the blessing, where God has blessed Abraham, his family, and now it's through him he's blessing all the families of the world. That's where you and I live. We are part of the blessed because we've heard this powerful message. And then anytime God calls, the answer has to be faith. That's just how it works with God. God calls us typically beyond where we are, and more often than not, he will call us from where we feel most comfortable. And he will beckon us to move forward in our journey with him where we have to trust him. We have to learn that we can believe what he says, that we can trust that he's going to provide in a way that only he can provide. And so guess what Abraham has to do? Abram still at this time. When God says go, the Bible doesn't really record any response from Abram. He doesn't speak back to God, but he doesn't have to do. He doesn't have to, because y'all have heard that phrase, actions speak louder than words. So what did he do? Look at verse 4. He went. He did what he was supposed to do. And so he is just an incredible, this story is just an incredible story. Now, with that said, let me just say this to you. You know, sometimes people think preachers are guilty of exaggeration, okay? But I would say this. I don't know that any preacher could exaggerate the role of Abraham. I'm not sure what all you'd have to say to exaggerate the role of Abraham. There has never been another person like Abraham. I would argue that outside of Jesus, I would contend Abraham's the single most important person who's ever lived, most influential person who's ever lived outside of Jesus. We did hear that, right? Remember Sunday morning we said Jesus is the most important person who's ever lived. I would say Abraham would be next in terms of incredible influence. As I just put here on your outline, think about Abraham. So for example, if you were to take time to study the Quran, which is the holy book of Islam, you'll discover that Abraham, according to Muhammad, he's the true model for all observers of Islam. Abraham, according to the teachings of Islam, he actually engaged in 4 of the 5 pillars of Islam. And it's according to their understanding of how Abraham lived his life. So, for example, he rejected idolatry. That's one pillar. He was a monotheist. He obeyed God's will. That's another pillar. He engaged on a pilgrimage to Mecca, according to the Quran. We don't have that in the Scripture. According to the Quran, he and Ishmael went to the holy city of Mecca, and he made sacrifices to God. Now, he didn't engage in Ramadan, okay? That will come later, so he doesn't actually check off all 5 pillars, if you will, but 4 of them he does. And so he is a true model, and Muhammad is viewed as a descendant of Abraham and Ishmael. Abraham and Ishmael are viewed generally as the father of the Arab peoples. And so Muhammad saw himself as a descendant of Abraham, both in his lineage and in his understanding of faith. And so he would even argue that the Jews will corrupt the religion of Abraham, and the Christians as well. And Islam is the true religion of Abraham. So think about today, there are about 1.8 billion Muslims on planet Earth, and they all call this man father. They look at him as the father of their faith. Some of them look at him as the father in their own lineage. Okay? So in their understanding, Ishmael is the son of promise for them. He's the firstborn. And so this whole story makes its way through him. Then think about the Jews. Abraham is the father of the Jewish people. You've gone from the story of humanity in the book of Genesis, in the story of redemption, to the story of the Hebrews. Well, Abraham is the father of the Hebrews. So he's the father of the Jewish people. And he receives the covenant. And think about how they talk about eternity. Sometimes, what's their phrase for paradise? The bosom of Abraham. So it's actually the final resting place of the faithful. That's how important he is. The covenant is received by Abraham, and the land is given to them. Do you know that when Jimmy Carter was president, he gave a lot of time and energy to try to bring peace to the Middle East? Y'all remember that? Some of y'all remember when Jimmy Carter was president? And do you know what Jimmy Carter required of every person that was going to work for him and be a part of any negotiation in the conversation in the Middle East? He made every one of them study the book of Genesis. Because Jimmy Carter said, you can't sit across from a Jew, whether that Jew be religious, orthodox, or secular, and understand their feelings about their land if you don't know the book of Genesis. I think Carter was right. There's something about the land promise connected to the covenant. And so Abraham is the one who receives that. He prefigures David. When David gets this royal covenant in Samuel, well, that royal covenant is actually rooted in the original covenant given to Abraham. So Abraham is the recipient of that covenantal blessing from God. He becomes a model of righteousness for the Jews. When you read rabbinical teachings that are extra-biblical, in other words, not just the teachings of the Scripture, but as the Jewish rabbis begin to teach the people about how to live, how to behave, Abraham becomes their model of righteousness. And some of that has to do with Abraham's humanity and how you can relate to him, but you watch him learn to obey God. As a matter of fact, as I said, when Jews die, oftentimes they'll refer to the final resting place as the bosom of Abraham. We even find that in the Scripture. And when a Jewish family has a son, and they take that son to the rabbi, and they engage in the rite of circumcision, they always say this at every time they perform the rite of circumcision. They welcome that boy into the covenant of Abraham. And so Abraham, his name is repeated over and over and over in the theology and the imagination and the conversations of Jews as they live out their faith. Well, what about us? How do we feel about Abraham? Well, Abraham is the progenitor of the Messiah. Matthew 1, verse 1. I mean, you start off the New Testament. Very first page, very first sentence. Jesus is called the son of David and the son of Abraham. And then his genealogy is given. Over and over and over, you'll find references to Abraham. Jesus is the descendant of Abraham. That's a part of his messianic fulfillment. And then, if you think about it, not only that, the New Testament writers, beginning with Jesus, the New Testament story actually beginning with Jesus, has this understanding of Abraham as being a father in the faith, not just a father genealogically. In fact, Jesus will have this debate with the Jews, long debate in John 8. Remember that conversation where they talk to Jesus about Abraham, and Jesus responds to them about Abraham, and he tells them about Abraham, and they respond back about Abraham. And then Jesus points them to the fact that Abraham actually looked forward to this day when the Messiah was coming, his day. And so the understanding that Abraham was this model of faith is going to be interpreted theologically by the apostles and the writers of the New Testament. And so what Paul's going to do in Romans 4, Galatians 3, Paul's going to help us understand that you and I as Christians, even if we're Gentiles, we're children of Abraham. Because that's who we are. We've inherited his way of faith. He makes it into Hebrews 11 as one of the great members of the Hall of Faith, if you will. So, Abraham, if you're a Muslim, if you're a Jew, If you're a Christian, we all call him Father Abraham. And he is an example to every one of us. And so that's why I said it'd be hard to exaggerate his role in the history of redemption. Now, when you're reading, if you start Genesis 11, verse 27, and you go through chapter 25, 11, that's where Abraham dies. Interestingly enough, he's buried by his two boys. You remember that? Isaac and Ishmael both come to the funeral. Funerals have a way of just bringing people together, don't they? And so even though these two boys, very disparate lives, when their daddy died, they both came home to bury their dad. Well, his journey, it's an incredible journey, but I want to make sure we all know this. If we accept Moses as the principal author of Genesis, which I do, and I think, there's a lot of debate about how Genesis was put together, y'all. My goodness. There are entire departments of Old Testament theology that have just spent all their time and energy on these first 5 books of the Bible and how did we get them. And there are all these theories that have to do with the way the story is told. And so, for example, there are some who say, well, the book of Genesis as well as the entire 5 books of the Bible originally were 4 different sources. And those 4 different sources, it's really easy I say it's really easy, according to them. It's really easy to figure out which source you're reading by the way they refer to God or the way they refer to the law. So sometimes when God is referred to with Yahweh, that source is called the Yahwist source. So in English, you would use a J to signify that. Some say, well, no, this is this when you read these sources, anytime Elohim is usually mentioned, well, that's another source. That's referred to as the E. Some say, well, the material that's provided in the first 5 books of the Bible has to do with the role of the priests. And so there's the priestly document. And then others say, well, the codification of the law is the Deuteronomic part of the law. And so you have these sources. So that theory is called the JEDP. So when you go to seminary, you have to deal with the JEDP anytime you study the first 5 books of the Bible. Here's the response, though, to that. We don't have any record textually of any of those sources. In other words, all we have is what we have. This has always existed, at least as best we can tell, as a whole. Does that make sense? So what we have is what we have. So that leads some scholars to say, well, we get it. We understand there are different nuances, different explanations. Maybe some of this material was gathered later. All that's possible. But if you ascribe to Moses being the principal author, Moses is standing here now at about 1450 BC-ish, give or take. So 1450 years before Christ, roughly. And he's looking backwards at this incredible story, and he's trying to give definition, context, and an understanding to the Jewish people of his day to take these oral traditions, all these teachings that have been passed down from generations under the inspiration of the Spirit of God, and put it all into a collective whole so these people can understand their place in history. Does that make sense? Almost every ancient civilization we know of did that. The Babylonians did it. The Assyrians did it. The Jews did it. We think Moses primarily is the author. So as Moses is writing this story, like any good historian, he has a purpose. Historians don't write just to write. And they don't just chronicle. No, the good ones don't. The bad ones do. The bad ones just list everything that happened. Well, that doesn't do you any good because too much stuff happens. So think about in the way you've learned history. You've got certain dates in your mind as how you hinge history. You know why you do that? Because some historian writing purposefully helped you understand that was an important date. You know, if I were to ask y'all, do y'all think December 7th, 1941 has any significance in the history of modern Western civilization? You would say, sure. Why? Pearl Harbor. And the historians who look back on that say, that's a day that turned a page of history. That's a day that we have to say was a hinge point. If you're a theologian and you're studying theological history, would you say that All Hallows Eve, October 31st, 1517, has any significance? Well, that's the day Martin Luther decided to go out on the front door of his church and take his 95 Theses and nail them to the front door of the church so that everybody could read why he thought the Roman Catholic Church was wrong in selling indulgences. Most historians look at that day and say, well, that's a hinge point. After that, everything changed. So Historians look back over things and they make decisions about how to interpret what's happened, and that helps us understand a little bit better the flow and the rhythm, if you will, of history. So, when you're reading, are y'all still with me? Okay, so when you're reading this, here's the deal. Moses isn't just chronicling. That's not what he's doing. Moses wants you to watch Abraham. And so this is about the faith journey of a man and the spiritual heritage that he had and the promise that he was supposed to be stewarding. So you're going to have big gaps in Abraham's life that Moses isn't even going to tell you about. I mean, he'll skip 30, 40 years in Abraham's life and not apologize for it, because in his mind, that doesn't, what happened during that time after Sarah dies, he didn't really tell us anything about Abraham. Abraham's going to get remarried many years later. Y'all remember this? He's going to have 6 more sons. Moses just almost casually just writes that off. You know why? Because it's not the main part of this story of this man's heritage of faith and the protection of the stewardship of the promise and the blessing. That's what's going on here. Okay? As a matter of fact, that's what's happening even on the other side of Abraham, because Moses is going to show you how this plays out through Abraham's children. So, this is not just a simple recounting of world history. It's theological, it's spiritual in its orientation. So, here's what's going to happen. Moses lays it out for you in Genesis 12, what Luke taught on last week. God says to him, if you'll go back to page 12, because that's where we're going to start today. I promise you we're going to get to my part here in just a minute. Okay, so chapter 12, here's what God says. I'm going to make you into a great nation. Okay, now that's quite a statement to a man and his wife who have no children, and she can't have children. Right? You think they don't both know she can't have kids by now? They have figured that out. Okay? I'll make you a great nation. I'm going to bless you, he says. I'm going to make your name great. You are going to be a blessing. As a matter of fact, God said, the people that bless you, I'll bless them. The ones that curse you, I'll curse. As a matter of fact, all families from now on are going to be blessed through you. Now, come on, y'all. Would y'all not think that's quite a promise? I mean, you are going to influence pretty much everything that happens from here on. I mean, can you imagine him going home and saying to Sarah, honey, you ain't going to believe who you're married to. I'm just going to tell you that right now. Whether or not you knew I was somebody, I'm telling you right now, I am somebody. Well, I don't know how all that went, but the point is, this man realized I'm in the middle of something way beyond me. So that's where this whole thing begins, okay? And it's going to take some crazy turns, isn't it? How many times Abraham think he's going to die? I mean, and he can't die because he doesn't have any children yet. So we can't let him die. He's going to be the father of a great nation. Okay, so we got to keep this man alive, and we got to keep his wife alive. That's a part of the story. Okay, so let's look at the part I'm supposed to teach on today. Let's start with the sojourn in Egypt. That's verse 10. There's a famine in the land, verse 10. And so Abram thinks, we may die. There's just not enough food to eat. You and I, it's hard for us to relate to this kind of thing. You know, Luke pointed out last week, these were nimble people. They had a certain journeying in their heritage, right? They were somewhat migratory. That was already a part of Abram's life. And so here's what he says. He says, all right, we're going to go and find food. This famine is so severe. So in other words, Abram is fearful that they might not live. So verse 11, then he gets to Egypt. Then he's afraid that when they see his beautiful wife, they might just kill him, because he does not know what the culture is in Egypt. Now, he used to live beyond Canaan, to where he began his journey. We don't know what the culture was like where he was, but he's already starting to think, I have no idea what kind of hospitality these people are going to show us. Abraham is going to display a different kind of hospitality in his adulthood, right? When they have guests, they're going to receive them, they're going to feed them, they're going to take care of them, but he doesn't know that's going to happen in Egypt. And so he says, okay, Sarah, Now, here's the thing. You already know, we're going to find out later, they're actually kin, okay? So I'm tired of y'all making fun of Alabama, okay? This guy was married to family, okay? So just deal with it is what we would say to y'all. So they're actually kin to one another. So it's technically not it's not a lie per se, but it's close enough to a lie. So and what's interesting about it is he tells Sarah, tell them you're my sister so that if they get you, I will live. What a great bargain. I'm trying to imagine Sarai at this time, as Luke says. Okay, so he says, when they see you, they'll say, this is his wife, they'll kill me and let you live. So tell them you're my sister, and I'll be treated well for your sake. Because after all, this story is about me. But anyway, so I don't mean to make fun of Abraham, but what I'm saying is, aren't you glad the Bible's so honest? These people don't glow in the dark. They're just real people. Abram's trying to figure this thing out. He's worried. He thinks he's going to die in Canaan. Now he thinks he's going to die in Egypt. And so he tells Sarah, let's do this. So sure enough, look at verse 14. When they came to Egypt, the Egyptians saw that Sarah was a beautiful woman. Pharaoh's officials saw her, praised her to Pharaoh. He took her into his palace. And then verse 16, he makes Abram wealthy. He gives him all of this stuff. Now, we think Abram was already somewhat of means prior to this, but this is an incredible change in his life. Okay? Look at verse 17. And then all of a sudden the Lord sent plagues to Pharaoh. That's a little precursor, isn't it? Okay? So Pharaoh, who we don't know much about him, but anyway, he summons Abraham and he says, hey, what have you done to me? Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she's my sister? I took her to be my wife. In other words, I took her in my house. Now take her back and go. In verse 20, he gave orders to give Abram about his men, about Abram to his men, and they sent him on his way, his wife, and they gave him everything they'd given him and let him take it with him. So Abraham, or Abram at this time, is going to leave here alive. His wife is alive. They still have no children. But he now is a very wealthy man. Now, you'll find wealth associated with patriarchs in the story. But the wealth is supposed to be stewarded and used generously. It was a sign of God's blessing in their mind, but it was also to be used generously. Abraham, is going to do just that. He's going to be a good steward of what God gives him. But I would tell y'all, when I look at this story, I would say both faith and failure are a part of Abraham's journey. God did not tell Abraham to tell this story about his wife, but that's what he did. It's got a deceptive feel to it. It lets you know this man is a real man. This is one of the reasons that in the Jewish teachings about Abraham, they like to use him and this story because they want to show you that even the patriarchs had feet of clay. They weren't perfect, but they were still righteous. And at the end of the day, they would do what was right. And Abraham is going to continue to learn. And Moses is writing a story about a man who's on a spiritual journey. He's only going to mature in this journey along the way. That's what's going to happen to this man. But notice God's provision in spite of his failures. And he leaves here now to be a steward of way more than he had when he arrived. Okay? Then, that connection to chapter 13, he and his nephew now are traveling together. So he comes back, makes his way to come back together and reunite with Lot. And notice verse 2, Abraham had become very wealthy in livestock and silver and gold. Okay, so, or Abram, rather, at this time still. So he finally goes to Bethel, where he had been before. Luke mentioned that last week. So that's a little north of Jerusalem, if you will. And there's where he had first built an altar. There he called on the name of the Lord. Now, verse 5, here's the challenge. These two men now have amassed so much that the land can't support them if they stay too close in proximity with one another. So what will they do? So look at verse 8. Abram, who's the uncle, he's the mature one. He says, here's the solution. You go one way, I'll go another. I'll let you pick. You look at the land, you make a decision, whatever it is that you choose, we'll go the opposite direction. And Abram was basically saying, I'm going to trust God to take care of us and our family. Once again, Moses is showing us the faith of this man and his faith journey. Okay? He's growing in his faith, as he should be, and his trust in God's provision. After all, God has provided for him miraculously, even in Egypt. Okay? So Lot looks around, if you'll look at verse 10, and Lot says, I want to go towards Zoar. That's where the land was a little better, on past the Dead Sea. In those days, it was better before, obviously, God's judgment. However, there was a problem with that part of the country. And what was the problem? Sodom and Gomorrah. You had these two highly immoral cities. Okay? But Lot chose to go that way. If you look at verse 13, the people of Sodom were wicked, sinning greatly against the Lord. But Lot chose that because he felt like the land was better and would provide for his family better. So Abram says, okay, and Abram then chooses to go the opposite direction. He's ultimately, verse 18, going to settle southwest of Jerusalem, southwest of Bethlehem. That's where Hebron is, and the trees, the oaks of Mamre. So Abram is going to settle in the southern part of Israel, or Judah. So they separate, but I want you to notice, Moses points out Abram is a man of faith. So look at verse 3. It says, from the Negev, from the south, down by Egypt, he went from place to place till he came to Bethel, the place between Bethel and Ai, where his tent had been earlier, where he had first built an altar. And look what Moses says about him. There Abram called on the name of the Lord. That's an Old Testament way of saying he stopped and worshiped God. He thanked God for God's provision for him, what God had done for him. Okay? Then, notice verse 18. Soon as he decided, here's where I'm going to live, and I'm going to settle my family, he built an altar. So he established a place of worship before he did anything else. This is where he was going to live, and at the center of it was going to be his worship of God. Look at God's answer to Abraham. Look at verse 14. The Lord said to Abram after Lot had parted from him, he said, look around where you are. To the north, south, east, and west, all the land that you see I will give you and your offspring forever. So I'll make your offspring like the dust of the earth. If anyone would count the dust, your offspring will be counted. Walk through the length and the breadth of this land. I'm giving it to you. So there's the practical application of the covenant. God said, I'm going to help you be a great nation. Well, how could you be a great nation in the ancient world if you had no land? That would have been impossible. There was no such thing as a nation without boundaries, without something they could control. And so God is telling Abraham, I'm going to fulfill my promise to you. I'm going to give you a place. And it's in this place. It's not going to be in Egypt. There's already a great nation there. There's already a dynasty there. That's not where you're going to go. I'm taking you to a place where all these tribal communities live. That'll be easier for you to overwhelm it. And God is going to provide for him. And he says, now this particular land, I'm going to make sure it's yours, and I'm giving it to you and your family. And so we end Genesis 13 with Abraham learning more about his faith, learning more about trusting God, learning more about this promise. The promise is still yet unfulfilled. There's no way for him to be a great nation right now. He has no children. He has no offspring. And so he's still trusting in God to provide something for him that he still does not yet see. But God has given him enough that he can see to help him continue further down the path. To me, that's how God typically works. He may not give you enough light to see what's at the end, but he will give you enough to inspire you, encourage you, so you can take the next step. That's exactly what he does for Abraham. I'm going to give you this land. I'm going to provide for you, and at some point, I'm going to answer this promise. And you now are going to have to live in obedience to me and wait until that day comes. And so that's where this particular chapter ends. So it's an incredible story, y'all. Obviously, it's to be continued, and it's our story because this is our father in the faith, Abraham, and we're going to learn from him as we go. All right, I'm going to stop right there. Online audience, thank you for joining us today. Room.